by Bohn and Abbey Subhan, June 26, 2019, 7:30 p.m. The UFC returns to Minnesota for the first time since 2012 on Saturday with UFC on ESPN 3, which takes place at Target Center in Minneapolis with a fight card that airs entirely on ESPN. Heavyweight contenders clash in the headliner of the card when Francis Ngannou, 13-3 MMA, 8-2 UFC, takes on fellow knockout specialist and former UFC champ Junior Dos Santos, 21-5 MMA, 15-4 UFC, in a matchup that could elevate the winner into a title shot opportunity. There are a few other noteworthy fights on the card, as well. For more on the numbers, check below for 54 pre-event facts about UFC on ESPN 3. ******** Main event: Ngannou has earned all 13 of his career victories by stoppage. Ngannou has earned all 8 of his UFC victories by stoppage. Ngannou is one of 4 modern-era UFC fighters to begin his career with the organization with 6 consecutive stoppages. Anderson Silva, Rich Franklin and Ronda Rousey also accomplished the feat. Ngannou is one of 9 fighters in UFC history to earn their first 8 victories with the promotion by stoppage. Ngannou's 8 stoppage victories since 2015 in UFC heavyweight competition are tied with Derek Lewis for most in the division. Ngannou absorbs just 1.94 significant strikes per minute in UFC heavyweight competition, the best rate among active fighters in the division. Ngannou and Lewis combined for 31 total strikes landed at UFC 226, the second fewest in a 3-round UFC fight that went the distance behind Jens Pulver vs. João Roque, 23, at UFC 26 in June 2000. Dos Santos competes in his 12th UFC headliner. He's 8-3 in his previous main event bouts. Dos Santos' 3-fight UFC winning streak in heavyweight competition is tied for the second longest active streak in the division behind Daniel Cormier, 4. Dos Santos' total fight time of 3 hours, 43 minutes and 23 seconds in UFC heavyweight competition is second most in company history behind Andrei Arlovski, 4 hours, 18 minutes and 13 seconds. Dos Santos' 15 victories in UFC heavyweight competition are third most in divisional history behind Arlovski, 16, and Frank Mir, 16. Dos Santos' 10 knockout victories in UFC heavyweight competition are tied with Lewis and Cain Velasquez for most in divisional history. Dos Santos' 14 knockdowns landed in UFC heavyweight competition are the most in divisional history. Santos has landed 1,064 significant strikes in UFC heavyweight competition, the most in divisional history. Dos Santos and Ben Rothwell combined for 234 significant strikes landed at UFC Fight Night 86, the second most in a single UFC heavyweight fight behind Fabricio Werdum vs. Marcin Tybura, 282, at UFC Fight Night 121. Dos Santos' 157 significant strikes landed against Rothwell stand as the single-fight UFC heavyweight record. Dos Santos' 92 significant body strikes landed against Rothwell are the single-fight UFC heavyweight record. Dos Santos defends 80.5% of all opponent takedown attempts in UFC heavyweight competition, the third highest rate in divisional history behind Marcin Tybura, 81.5%, and Alexander Volkov, 81.5%. Co-main event: Joseph Benavidez, 27-5 MMA, 14-3 UFC, competes in his 16th UFC flyweight bout, the most appearances in divisional history. Benavidez's 12 victories in UFC flyweight competition are second most in divisional history behind Demetrius Johnson, 13. Benavidez's 5 stoppage victories in UFC flyweight competition are tied with John Moraga for second most in divisional history behind Johnson, 7. Benavidez's 4 knockout victories in UFC flyweight competition are tied with John Lineker and Dustin Ortiz for the most in divisional history. Benavidez's 3 fight night bonuses for UFC flyweight bouts are tied with Louis Smolka for second most in divisional history behind Johnson, 9. Jazier Formiga, 23-5 MMA, 9-4 UFC, competes in his 14th UFC flyweight bout, tied for the third most appearances in divisional history behind Benavidez, 16, and Johnson, 15. Formiga's 4-fight UFC winning streak in flyweight competition is tied with Henry Cejudo for the longest active streak in the division. Formiga's 9 victories in UFC flyweight competition are tied for third most in divisional history behind Johnson, 13, and Benavidez, 12. Formiga's 3 submission victories in UFC flyweight competition are tied for second most in divisional history behind Johnson, 5. Formiga defends 86.2% of all opponent takedown attempts in UFC flyweight competition, the second highest rate in divisional history behind Ian McCall, 90%. Remaining main card: Demian Maia, 26-9 MMA, 20-9 UFC, 41, is the oldest of the 24 fighters scheduled to compete at the event. Maia competes in his 30th UFC bout, tied for the third most appearances in company history behind Donald Cerrone, 32, and Jim Miller, 32. Maia's total fight time of 6 hours 3 minutes and 12 seconds in UFC competition is fourth most in company history behind Frankie Edgar, 6 hours 47 minutes and 33 seconds, Michael Bisping, 6 hours 5 minutes and 33 seconds, and Jeremy Stephens, 6 hours 5 minutes and 23 seconds. Maia's 20 victories in UFC competition are tied with Bisping and Georges St. Pierre for second most in company history behind Cerrone, 23. Maia's 20 victories in UFC competition are the most of any Brazilian fighter in company history. Maia is 11-5 since he dropped to the UFC welterweight division in July 2012. Maia's 10 submission victories in UFC competition are tied with Royce Gracie for second most in company history behind Charles Oliveira, 13. Maia's 8 submission victories via rear naked choke in UFC competition are most in company history. Maia is 20-2 in UFC bouts in which he completes at least one takedown. He's completed at least one takedown against 22 of his 29 UFC opponents. Maia once went a combined 0 for 49 on takedown attempts over a 3-fight UFC stretch. It's the longest streak of failed attempts in UFC history without a takedown landed. Maia was unsuccessful on all 21 of his takedown attempts against champ Tyron Woodley at UFC 214, the second worst title fight output in UFC history behind Diego Sanchez's 0 for 27 effort against BJ Penn at UFC 107. Maia completed just 2 of 22 takedown attempts in his unanimous decision loss to Rory MacDonald at UFC 170. Those 22 takedown attempts were the most in a single UFC welterweight bout. Anthony Rocco Martin, 16-4 MMA, 8-4 UFC, is 4-0 since he returned to welterweight in April. He's 7-0 in the weight class, overall. Martin is one of 16 fighters in UFC history with a submission win by Anaconda choke. He accomplished the feat at UFC Fight Night 142 in December. Vink Pickle, 11-2 MMA, 4-2 UFC, is 2-1 since returning from a career-long layoff that lasted from May 2014 to June 2017. Pickle lands 63% of his takedown attempts in UFC lightweight competition, the third highest rate in divisional history behind Islam Makhachev, 70.8%, and Penn, 66.7%. Marco Polo Reyes, 8-5 MMA, 4-2 UFC, average fight time of 6:53 in UFC lightweight competition is second shortest among active fighters in the weight class behind Oliveira at 5:08. Reyes lands 6.13 significant strikes per minute in UFC lightweight competition, the fourth highest rate in divisional history behind Justin Gaethje, 8.5, Dustin Poirier, 7.11, and TJ Grant, 6.83. Alonzo Menifield, 8-0 MMA, 1-0 UFC, has earned all of his career victories by stoppage. 7 of those wins are by knockout. Paul Craig, 11-3 MMA, 3-3 UFC, has earned all of his career victories by stoppage. He's finished 10 of those wins by submission. Craig's victory at 4:59 of round 3 at UFC Fight Night 127 is the latest submission in a 3-round UFC fight. Preliminary card: Ricardo Ramos, 12-2 MMA, 3-1 UFC, 23, is the youngest of the 24 fighters scheduled to compete at the event. Ramos is one of 2 fighters in UFC history to earn a knockout victory stemming from a spinning back elbow. He accomplished the feat at UFC 217. Dong Hyun Kim is the other fighter to win with the technique. Eric Anders, 11-4 MMA, 3-4 UFC, 3-fight losing skid as the longest of his career. He hasn't earned a victory since August 2018. Anders is 1-4 in his past 5 fights after starting his career on a 10-fight winning streak. Anders is 0-2 in UFC light heavyweight competition. Emily Whitmire's 4-2 MMA, 2-1 UFC, 61 second victory at UFC on ESPN 1 marks the fastest submission in UFC strawweight history. Maurice Green, 7-2 MMA, 2-0 UFC, is one of 2 heavyweights in UFC history to earn a submission by triangle choke. Stefan Struve owns 2 wins with the technique. Junior Albini's 14-5 MMA, 1-3 UFC, 3-fight losing skid as the longest of his career. He hasn't earned a victory since July 2017. For more on UFC on ESPN3, check out the UFC Rumors section of the site. UFC research analyst and live statistics producer Michael Carroll contributed to this story. Follow him on Twitter at MeekFlipDascript. Alonzo Menifield, Anthony Rocco Martin, Demian Maia, Emily Whitmire, Eric Anders, Francis Ngannou, Joseph Benavidez, Junior Albini, Junior Dos Santos, Jessier Formiga, Marco Polo Reyes, Maurice Green, Paul Craig, Ricardo Ramos. UFC on ESPN3, Bink Pickle, News, UFC, Videos. Let's block ads.